Hello, Peter for Son Azir Sirus here, and I'm here to talk about what is perhaps one of my most favorite franchises in video games. Now, people who've watched various of my videos would probably guess it would be the Tales series, and you'd be kinda wrong. The Tales series is my second favorite game franchise. My absolute favorite gaming franchise is Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem. There's just so much I love about the series, like how I think it blends turn-based strategy, combat, and role-playing game mechanics together perfectly, how it usually got great map designs, interesting stories, how the dragons in those games are actual threats in comparison to other long-standing RPG series, and overall I think the games are just a blast to play through. But alas, it did seem that the Fire Emblem series has always been that one series that people have always overlooked when they think of Nintendo. And can you really blame them? I mean, the series didn't even have a Western release till its 7th installment. Its 7th installment! That's a lot of Fire Emblem games that never got released to the West. But fortunately, it does seem that the series' reputation did skyrocketed with the release of Fire Emblem Awakening last year. And people does seem to be paying more attention to Fire Emblem. Well, at least I think so, anyway. Heck, there's even a Shin Megami Tensei and Fire Emblem crossover game that's in the making. Though we don't really have much more news about it, except that it's being developed. And it's a really bizarre crossover. But still, outside of that, it does seem that the Fire Emblem series has been getting some more popularity, and I'm glad about that. Fire Emblem as a series is fantastic, and I do think it should at least get some recognition of how great it is. I just really love the series overall. Heck, the first Fire Emblem game that was localized in North America, which is really the 7th game in the series, Fire Emblem Blazing Sword, was the reason why I really got hooked into strategy RPGs. And so to commemorate my love for the Fire Emblem series, I am going to make a Fire Emblem series ranking videos, which is pretty much like my Tales series ranking videos, but instead of Tales games, I'm going to rank the Fire Emblem titles from my least favorite to my most favorite game. And like my Tales ranking videos, you can pretty much expect this to be a long video. So yeah. So without further ado, let's begin this ranking video. Starting from my least favorite Fire Emblem game is Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. And apparently I'm not alone in this assessment, since it does seem that the majority, or at least a good amount of Fire Emblem fans, do consider Shadow Dragon to be the weakest of the localized Fire Emblem games. Now, as for my own thoughts of this game, I just think it's a really boring Fire Emblem game. Essentially, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon is a remake of the first game. And oh boy! That is showing the end product. Usually when a remake gets trashed by people, it's usually because it's strayed too far from the source material. Not in the case of Shadow Dragon. In its case, it's one of the cases where the source material just ports what's in the original and doesn't really add anything new. To what I question, why did you remake the game? And I wouldn't really have this problem if it was a straight port, but there are various additions in Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon that try to spice things up, and most of those additions just feel pointless or is just really unappealing to me. I mean, if you're going to try to remake the game and add a few new mechanics in, just really go all out to make it feel fresh while still retaining the spirit of the original. Cause as is, Shadow Dragon does feel a bit slow and dated in some parts, such as Marth being the only character to be able to visit villages, or how most of the characters in Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, well, the one you can use, barely have any personalities because they barely have any dialogue to work with. I mean, the main cast of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon do, but the rest might as well just be blank slates. Heck, even Fire Emblem Ray and Dawn has more meaningful dialogue for the side characters than Shadow Dragon. I mean, sure, Fire Emblem Ray and Dawn does have a generic support system where most of the support dialogue are pretty generic one-liners, but at least that game had an entire game to build all the characters that appear in Shadow Dragon, and even barring that, the game still have base conversations to really build upon the character that you be controlling. In Shadow Dragon, you got basically nothing. So yeah, elements like those can really drag the experience down and make the game feel dated compared to the Fire Emblem game that was localized. I mean, again, I wouldn't mind if it was straight port. If it was, I could have looked at Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon as a history piece, but as it is, it's a remake with some pretty annoying changes. I mean, there's some nice changes, like the changes to the user interface, and it is also nice to finally see Marth's story, but besides those elements, yeah, I'm not really a fan of the changes. The most notable change, that's probably for the worst in my opinion, is probably the requirements for the guiding chapters, and the requirements pretty much this. You have to kill off some of your allied units in order to maintain a set number of units you can use, and that's the main problem. Why would a game that punishes you for losing units via permanent death encourages killing off your units in order to access an extra chapter? And it's not like XCOM Enemy Unknown where you're basically able to create a character whenever you lose a unit. I mean, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon does provide you with a good amount of units to go through, but yeah, I still think that mechanic, just killing off your units in order to gain access to a guiding chapter, is just bullshit. Also considering the fact that most Fire Emblem players are perfectionists in terms of trying to keep every character alive throughout playthrough, as well as trying to recruit all the characters through a playthrough, you can see how this mechanic can piss off Fire Emblem fans. And then there's the class changing mechanic, where I don't think it's that significant of mechanic to add, as class changing really only changes stack rolls, unlike in Fire Emblem Awakening, where class change not only change your stack rolls but also give you specific skills when you reach a certain level, which did encourage you to class change. There was just more to the class changing mechanic in Awakening as compared to Shadow Dragon. I know it's unfair to compare Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and Awakening's class changing mechanic, since Awakening did came after Shadow Dragon, but even without comparing to Awakening, there isn't really much to Shadow Dragon class changing mechanic. It just feels like a mechanic that was just tacked on without much thought. And another thing, that you do lose character individuality with the class changing mechanic in Shadow Dragon. Well, I also think this does apply a bit to Awakening, but I think Awakening does do a better job in terms of retaining character individuality in the game. And let's not forget about the other change aesthetically. Is the art style of this game not all that pleasant to look at? I mean, scratch that, it's not even the art style, it's the character models. They just look really ugly and bland to me, so yeah. Long story short, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon is probably my least favorite Fire Emblem game. Is it a bad game? No. Is it a good remake? I would argue that it's not, even though it still retained the essence of the original game. It just doesn't really update much. As it is, there's just so much going against it that I couldn't really enjoy it very much. At number 7 is Fire Emblem Sacred Stones. Now this game I really liked when I played through it when it first came out, but looking back at it, yeah, I can probably see how this game's flaws does make it one of the weaker Fire Emblems that we got. So okay, what's the good stuff in it? Well, I think the main antagonist is a great tragic character, which I really like. There's post-game stuff to do in Fire Emblem Sacred Stones via the tower and rune dungeons that you can do. And Fire Emblem Sacred Stone is mechanically sound in the SRPG departments. I mean, it got the usual permanent death, weapon triangle, supports, weapon ranks. Classes are largely the same from Blazing Sword, with there being a new few additions like the Wyvern Knight. And the level design is also good for the most part, and there is a variety of map conditions throughout the game to mix things up. The main problem of this title is just mostly two things for me. Firstly, the game is way too easy for a Fire Emblem game. I mean seriously, even if you don't consider that you can grind in this game, the enemy units are a joke in this game, and the final stage is probably the easiest to trivialize out of all the Fire Emblem games. Okay, maybe except for Sealed Swords, where you basically can one-hit KO the boss if you know what you're doing, which basically amounts to using a specific item or specific character against said final boss in Sealed Sword. But besides that, Fire Emblem Sacred Stones is probably the easiest Fire Emblem game that I've played, and it is kind of too easy at times, so yeah. The other problem in this game for me is that there aren't enough changes to Fire Emblem Sacred Stones for it to warrant an open world format. Let me explain. Most Fire Emblem games are pretty linear in that you go from one stage to the next via defeating enemy units or a defense stage and etc. And because of that, they are designed around that. That's why you got characters designated with specific classes, why you got limited weapon uses or limited weapons kind of. This is why you have to manage your characters right so that you have a balanced team to beat the game, why you got limited funds, and etc. Fire Emblem have always had players to consider both short-term strategies via figuring out a strategy to win the level and long-term strategy in terms of thinking ahead with you having to figure out how to manage your items and gold well enough to complete future stages, as well as managing your characters in terms of levels so that they can go toe-to-toe with enemy units and still having balanced team. And all this basically blends RPG and strategic turn-based elements together perfectly just to create a very fun and well-designed game. And essentially, Fire Emblem Sacred Stones is designed like that, which is fine if there wasn't a world map system. Now in the map system, the long-term strategy aspect of Fire Emblem is gone, since you can essentially grind your characters as compared to before, where you had to methodically think about which character or how much to use that character in each stage, as well as being able to earn any amount of gold for you in this game, so you can buy as many weapons as you need. But this aspect can be okay in the long scheme of things if the game is able to add anything new to the formula with the world map system. It doesn't. Well, not anything substantial. I mean, yeah, it does add a couple customization options such as class changing, which does add to the game, as well as post-game dungeons, but even then, there isn't much stuff to do in the game itself. When I think of SRPG world map systems, I think of games that have vast class changing mechanics that has loads of customization options, which would prompt me to do a lot of experimentation, as well as there being tons of stuff to do in the game. Sadly, Fire Emblem Sacred Stone doesn't provide that, and as well as taking away the long-term strategy aspects of Fire Emblem, which is a letdown. And not to mention, this game is really easy too. Next on the list is Fire Emblem Sword of Seals, or Sealed Sword, or Biting Blade, or whatever the hell it's called now. Anyway, this is the game where Roy comes from, the popular Smash character that was in Super Smash Bros. Melee, along with Marth. So what is there to say about Fire Emblem Sword of Seals? Well, there's a lot of good stuff that I like. For one, it basically improved the support system from past games to basically the current support system that Fire Emblem fans all know and love. The level design is also really good for the most part, with the game implemented Fog of War in a way that makes it pretty fun to strategize around. Unlike in Dark Souls 776 where it's entirely dark so you can't really strategize around that. Fire Emblem Sword series also probably has the most guidance stages out of the Fire Emblem that I played, and they're pretty fun to unlock as well as complete, and the rewards for them are pretty good. And the SRPG elements are fun too. And to add, Fire Emblem Sword of Sirius was probably the game where you see they tried to make it very accessible to everybody, with it having a much more clean and simple user interface. There being multiple difficulty settings, being able to determine your unit position at the start of battle, etc., which made the game much more fast paced and probably more easier to get into in comparison to Genealogy or Tharcia 776, which were the games that came before Fire Emblem Sword of Seals, though the accessibility did come at a cost. And that cost was that Sword of Seals didn't really retain much of the intricate mechanics from the past games, or had mechanics to make it stand out, like the skill system, fatigue system, capturing, etc. It still had a decent amount of mechanics of its own that got carried from the past games, like rescuing and the support system, which it improved to the support system we know and love today. But barring that, it didn't really have anything to make it really stand out, besides it being the game where intelligence system really did try to make it accessible to everybody. And the level design of Fire Emblem Sword of Seals also follow the same pattern. While they're clearly well designed and fun to go through, they still didn't really feel all that unique compared to the previous game that came before it. It didn't have the large and grand scale that Genealogy did, or it wasn't as merciless as Tharcia 776 is. All in all, when I think of Fire Emblem Sword of Seals, I probably think of the typical Fire Emblem game, which isn't a bad thing. A typical Fire Emblem game is still a great SRPG by its own right. It's just that it didn't feel as unique as some of the other games in the series that came before it or even after it. In the end, Fire Emblem Sword of Seals is a well-designed, if typical Fire Emblem game, and it is very accessible so newcomers can come in and play. Though it is certainly annoying for veterans who want to play on a harder difficulty, since you do have to play the game on the normal difficulty first before you can even access to the hard difficulty. And speaking of annoying, there are some aspects to the game which really did detract from the experience. Firstly, the final boss in this game can be cheesed pretty easily, which just makes it sort of a letdown. And need I say more about Roy promotion, which comes way too late, which makes him essentially the worst lord of the Fire Emblem series in a gameplay point of view. But the worst lord I've ever played in a Fire Emblem game. Yeah, Roy fans are gonna seriously hate me for this. Yeah, he's really bad in his own game. In Smash, he's pretty cool. Sword of Seals, not so much. The only reason why he's a viable character after he promotes is because of how overpowered Sword of Seal is. Even then, that weapon got a limited use of 20 uses. And if you're wondering how late does he promote, he promotes near the end of the game. And the worst part about his late promotion is that Roy is dead weight for most of the game, because of, you know, he can't promote. So yeah, Roy is probably the worst lord I have seen in a Fire Emblem thus far. And need I say about his character? Personally speaking, I find his character to be bland as all hell. I mean seriously, I cannot find one interesting thing about this guy. He doesn't go through any interesting arcs or any interesting dilemmas. If anything, Roy is the poster boy for bland JRPG protagonist to me. Only interesting thing about the guy is his romantic possibilities. And that is interesting because Roy got the most marriage possibilities of any Fire Emblem lord. So yeah, not a fan of Roy, personally. I mean, even barring his gameplay flaws, I still find him so boring. Anyway, as for other elements of the game, like the story, music, characters, etc., they're fine for the most part, though I would probably say that the main antagonist probably doesn't really give me much of an impression in this game. It's really only in Blazing Sword, where he's really more fleshed out, that I do find him to be an effective tragic antagonist. When Swords of Seals itself, not so much. All in all, Fire Emblem Sword of Seals is probably the average Fire Emblem for me. At number 5 is Fire Emblem Awakening. Yeah, Apparently the Fire Emblem game that basically gave Fire Emblem series some sort of recognition is only number 5 in my ranking video. But still, I do love Fire Emblem Awakening. I mean, I played around 300 hours in the first month that I got released, so it must do quite a few things right. For one, the pair mechanic that Fire Emblem Awakening has is pretty awesome, as it does open up very strategic opportunities in terms of deciding which type of character you want to pair up, since pair bonuses is different depending on the classes and bond, as well as opening up strategic elements in terms of determining movement, along with emphasizing the support system that Fire Emblem fans has come to know and love. And there are also intricacies in determining which character should be the main guy and which character should be the supporting person, since there are pros and cons to that. And speaking of support system, the generation system that was in Genealogy comes back in some form in this game, which is nice. The other thing that it does right is that it probably does go all the way with the world map system that was implemented in Sacred Stones, with it providing you with lots of customization options via the robust class changing system, being able to reclass your unit extensively, a skill system which basically allow units to learn unique passive abilities that range from just increasing their stats, to reflecting damage, to even moving after you kill an enemy. And each class essentially had their own unique set of skills you could learn as you leveled the class up. And speaking of classes, there is certainly a lot of classes in Awakening, well, in comparison to other Fire Emblem games, which I think is nice and does add to the customization options in terms of being able to reclass and promote to different classes. And the classes themselves are very unique from each other, and the characters still do feel different from each other, even in terms of class changing, since there are some classes that some characters don't have access to. And each character more or less got their own unique set of growth rates, though it is modified by the class they're in. Awakening also provides lots of side content for the players to mess around with, via paralog chapters, spotlight battles, DLC maps, and etc. And Fire Emblem Awakening got the usual Fire Emblem mechanics that makes it a Fire Emblem game, via weapon triangle, individualized unit divided into specific classes, permanent death, even though you can turn on casual mode which negates permanent death, and etc. Even though it did take a few stuff out like light magic, the magic trinity system, and a con, and etc. But there's enough Fire Emblem mechanics that it is indistinguishably a Fire Emblem game. It's just a Fire Emblem game that is designed around having an open world format, where most of the game in the series was designed around being linear role-playing games outside of Gaiden and Sacred Stones, and Awakening does it well, unlike Sacred Stones. And also unlike Sacred Stones, the game does provide a good challenge at times, well, at least on hard mode. Yeah, you're able to grind the game, but at least there is a universal place like the tower or ruins, and it's more random, so it isn't a factor that you can count on all the time. Even then, you can probably only do a few counters at a time, you being only able to summon more reason with a recon box. And let me tell you, the reward you get from summoning reasons with recon box do not offset the cost of buying a recon box on hard mode. So the random battles are at least balanced in a degree in comparison to Sacred Stones, where you can infinitely grind without any cost. Though grinding is pretty much non-existent in Lunatic mode except for DLC maps, so with all the praises, why is it only number 5? Well, that is because of the flaws. Firstly, Fire Emblem Awakening biggest flaw in my opinion is the level design. Well, the map design to be more apparent. The map design is just very uninspired. The level design is just very bland in my opinion. I don't know, maybe it was because I was coming from Radiant Dawn, but the level design in Awakening just felt subpar in comparison to most of the other games in the series. Albeit there are a few good well designed chapters here and there, but for the most part, I have to say that Awakening got one of the weaker level designs of the Fire Emblem games that I played. And what's worse is that most of the levels are pretty much just route chapters or defeat the boss chapters. There's no really much variety, there's no defense maps or some of the more clever level designs that you see in other games. It's just very generic, which is very upsetting. If Fire Emblem Awakening had the absolute marvelous level design of Radiant Dawn, this would probably be one of my favorite Fire Emblem games, but as it is, it's only number 5 because of the level design. And that's not really the only negative I have with Fire Emblem Awakening. The next is the story. It's probably one of the weaker Fire Emblem stories I've played, and I think the main problem to the story is that it's rushed. Fire Emblem Awakening just felt like it was trying to tell you 3 different types of stories, with the first 2 having some link to the third, and it just feels incredibly rushed as a result. You don't really have much time to invest in the story. There's no sufficient build up for us to be invested. And I really want to be invested. The characters are really likable and fun, and each have their own quirks because of the support system that really fleshes out the character, but the story is just so rushed. And that rush feeling also affects the antagonist, as the antagonist just comes and goes very quickly that we never feel really intimidated by them or even really get to know them all that well in terms of the story. Not to say everything in the story is dud. There are instances in the story where I did got emotionally invested and interested in the story, but for the most part the story is just really rushed. Overall, I say Awakening is still a very fun game. It's a great game. It's probably my favorite 3DS game I got right now, and it is extremely accessible for players who haven't played the Fire Emblem series, or heck, haven't played an SRPG in general. So I say pick it up if you haven't already. Next on the list is Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Now this game is pretty mixed in the Fire Emblem community from what I've known. Fans either love this game or hate this game. Me personally, I love it. I love how grand it can be. I love the animations. I love the mechanic in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn that was either introduced or modified from Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Well, most of the changes, such as the skill system being more customizable, the third tier system really adding to the scope of the game, them adding back Black Magic to the game, as well as modifying Magic Trinity a bit, though Black Magic doesn't really play much of a role in the game. The terrain elevation mechanic, which did add another layer of dimension in terms of strategizing for the defense maps in this game, along with other stuff that this game does mechanically. But the thing that I love the most about Radiant Dawn is the level design. Oh my goodness, do I love the level design in this game. In my personal opinion, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn got the best level design out of any localized Fire Emblem game. Level design manages to capture the grand scope of Genealogy the Holy War while not making the map size to be too big that it drags out too much. The battles in Radiant Dawn were just so intense, grand in terms of scale, and it is glorious. Not only is the level design great because of the grand scope it provides, but the levels themselves are just well designed in terms of what type of terrain to put in, what type of enemy they put in, and where on the map, the various map conditions they put in, etc. Which will overall get you thinking and engaged in terms of determining what is the best way to proceed, which units are best to use against this particular type of group of enemies, or even one particular type of enemy that is on the field, and etc. The level design is just masterful in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. The game provides fun, varied, and clever levels, with the game having my absolute favorite defense map in the entire series. I have personally played Radiant Dawn about 4 times just because the levels are just so much fun to go through. The only Fire Emblem I can probably see as being superior in level design as compared to Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn is probably Fire Emblem Tharsia 776. Though I haven't beaten that Fire Emblem, so can't really comment on it, and that game also not gonna be on the list since I haven't beaten it. And I have to add that I really do love the music in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn overall was just so much fun for me to play through, and I will more than likely do more playthroughs of the game in the future. Heck, there are also some other neat stuff that I like about it. I like the fact that we got our first Mage Lord in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, which did change how I would normally play Fire Emblem initially, with how most Lord characters in Fire Emblem have been physical units. I also really do like how the final bosses of the game really do differentiate themselves from the other bosses, with them adding some sort of mechanic that can affect multiple units, which really does make them very memorable. And overall, it's just little changes like these that makes Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn so unique, so fun, while still retaining that usual Fire Emblem style. There's just so much to Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn mechanically and to its level design that I keep getting drawn back to it. But with that said, I do see why some people don't like the game. For one, the game is pretty unforgiving to newcomers with how difficult it can be at some parts of the game. Well, except me, I love the difficulty. The second part is the story. Yeah, I like how epic and grand it can be, but I'd be lying if I said the story was well written when it's not. Most notably the third chapter of the game with its blood pact plot device, which makes it very contrived for some events. There's just some events that just feels really contrived because of the blood pact. And not to mention the main villain plan is a bit convoluted. Though even if it is somewhat poorly written, I probably did got more invested in Radiant Dawn's story than Awakening story, which was way too rushed. And even then, I really do like some parts of the story, such as some of the personal dilemma that some of the character faces, most notably Alencia. And let's not forget about some of the retcons in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. But still, even with that, I still enjoy parts of the story in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Another negative thing is the character balance in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Yeah, the character balance can be pretty jarring, with there being some useless characters, like Lara or Fiona. Though the useless characters are pretty few, and most of the other characters are pretty usable in their own right. But the last negative thing I probably agree with other fans is the support system. Yeah, they kind of butchered it in terms of character development for the characters. Gameplay wise, it's probably the most flexible support system, with you being able to support with anybody, and it doesn't really do anything bad in the gameplay point of view, but it does make the character interaction to be really generic, which is probably one of the worst things you can do to the support system. Because when you get down to it, most people did use the support system to see the character interaction and development rather than a gameplay point of view, even though the support system does help gameplay wise. But even with those very glaring flaws, I still love Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, and will likely be a game that I will continue to replay over and over again just based on how much I love the game. Okay, now we're going to the home stretch. The next game on the list is Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. Suffice to say, there is a lot of stuff that I really love about Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. The game got great level design, with most of the levels being a lot of fun to play through and having variety. Heck, I have to say that the Priest chapter is probably one of the most creative levels I played in a Fire Emblem game. Hell, I say Path of Radiance got probably one of the more creative levels I've seen in the series. And that's probably got to do with how there are a couple of stages you can complete without eliminating a single type or single faction of enemies, with the game giving you good incentive to do so. The aforementioned Priest chapter is one example, but there's also a Prison and Desert chapter that does this. Albeit it is time consuming, but pretty doable and rewarding. And there's also a stage where you have to do a mini side quest where you're able to change the dynamic of the stage, as well as getting a pretty nifty item. So yeah, the levels are pretty creative. Mechanically, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance was also good in this department as well. The game got the usual Fire Emblem mechanics you expect, which make a Fire Emblem fun, along with adding a bunch of stuff to it, such as bringing back the skill system from Genealogy, though giving its own spin, with you being able to manipulate skills more in Path of Radiance in terms of learning various skills, which did add customization to it. The introduction of the Legu's unit, the soldier unit actually being a real unit, not just a fodder unit like in other games, modifying other units to fit the skill system, with some units getting abilities they got from past games, such as mounted units having the ability to use all their movement space after attacking or using an item if they have any movement space left, which is pretty different in comparison to the GBA games, where if you were to attack with a mounted unit, their turn would end automatically even if they had like 1 or 2 space to move left, though they could move after using an item if they still have movement spaces left. And all these emblems really did change the dynamic to how you would think to approach a battle or strategize compared to the GBA games. And all of this combined with the clever level design really made the SRPG battle mechanics to be really engaging. Path of Radiance also added mechanics that revolve outside battle with the bonus experience mechanic, which was an interesting mechanic since bonus experience did reflect on how well you did the various levels you were going through. And the game also go heavily more in depth with the base mechanic that was in past Fire Emblem games, which does overall give more emphasis on before battle preparation, which I liked. Though I'd probably say my favorite aspect of the more in-depth base mechanic is probably the info conversations, which really does give us a chance to learn more about the world of Path of Radiance as well as characters. I especially like seeing various character dialogue regarding the battle they just did, as it does feel that the characters are being affected by the various events that's happening in the game. And there's also a bunch of other modifications to the formula which I like, such as how to advance support conversation in this game, and I could probably go on all day say why I love Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, but I would just leave it at that in terms of mechanics. Story-wise, I really did enjoy Path of Radiance's story. I found the world tales to be pretty interesting, as each country just seemed to have this rich history to it as you learn about each country that the game takes us to. You really do get a feeling with how each country is run at a governmental level, as well as knowing how the citizen would generally act, such as Dane's superiority complex of the Lagoos. You can see how they would develop the complex with some of the stuff that the Dane government enforced, such as the Lagoos hunts. And it's elements like these that really does make Tales to be really interesting and feel like a real world. And I have to be honest, the world of Telius is probably my favorite Fire Emblem universe, and the plot is actually pretty good. I think that the story got a good scale in terms of how grand the game can get. It got likable, interesting characters, as well as doing good drama with them. I also really like Ike's character development from the start of the game to the finish in terms of how he learns the ropes of being the leader, though still getting help from his friends from start to finish, how he learns about the world and develop his own morality as he interacts with people coming from the different cultures of the world, and etc. And overall, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance got a well-crafted story that I enjoy. And overall, Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is just a well-crafted strategy role-playing game in general, though I do have some complaints about the game. Now, the complaints might only register to me, but one of the flaws is that I do think Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is one of the easier Fire Emblem games, and I would probably like it more if it was a bit harder. Well, I'd probably like it more if they didn't remove the Japanese Maniac mode in the English release. The animations of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is also kinda stiff, especially compared to Radiant Dawn and Awakening. Though I probably do give leeway in this regard, since Fire Emblem Path of Radiance is their first 3D title. Well, in terms of creating 3D polygons titles. At number 2 is Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy Wars. Now, out of all the Fire Emblem games that I play personally, I'd probably say this does feel the most unique out of all the games I play in the series, and that's probably got to do with the generation system of how you essentially play the children and the main cast of characters in the first half of the game, and how the system basically helped modify how good the cast of the second half of the game could be depending on which type of character that you paired up in the first half. And the generation system is probably much more prominent here than in Awakening, since the characters you can get from the generation system in Awakening were entirely optional, while in this game it plays a major part, since you do have to control the second gen characters in the second half of the game, which really did give the generation system in Genealogy of Holy Wars much more impact in comparison to Awakening. Another thing that made this game very unique was just how massive the maps could be, and just the vast amount of troops that you had to cut through in order to beat each stage. And while the map designs were fairly open field, the level design was still pretty strong in terms of the various enemy formations you were encountering in the fields and how each unit was positioned in the formation, where you would need to be smart on how you tackle them, especially with the sheer amount of units that you could face in each formation. If you weren't careful, you could easily be very overwhelmed. The sheer scope of the enemy just made it very unique gameplay wise compared to other games, and it really did felt like you're fighting a large scale war. And even though all the missions were siege missions, it did felt like those mission types fit with the large scale battles that Genealogy brought to the table. There's also various other mechanics that Genealogy brought to the table, such as the skill system that was first introduced in the series, where, as I said before, is a system where your characters could learn passive skills that will change how you went to a battle. And this is especially true for Genealogy, since there is a lot of game-changing passive skills in the game, like how you need a skill to be able to do a double attack, that and having more speed than an enemy unit. Though in Genealogy case, you basically just needed one more speed point over the enemy to basically double them if you had the pursuit skill. Or how a character with Wrath would continuously land critical hits if their HP was less than half. There are also other mechanics that really did make Genealogy stand out on its own, such as how class promoting worked, how you could repair your weapon, how the arena worked, etc. The mechanics overall, as well as the level design, were great for Genealogy, and it did really make the game stand out from other Fire Emblem games, even to this day. The game overall just had this very grand, epic scale that the other games in this series did not match, with the exception of Ray and Dawn. And not only in terms of gameplay did the game felt very grandiose, but also the story that it told. The story contained political manipulation of the various states and countries that the game takes place in, how a young lord responds to the political upheavals that happen in the country as he fights for what he believes is right, the journey of seeing how an oppressive empire came to be through political means, a grand venture of how a small rebel force for good defeat said oppressive empire, and the tragic story of the man that was responsible for creating that empire, and etc. The tale overall was just very epic and sweeping, and it really did got me invested as I played through it. It also really felt grand that the story that Genealogy of the Holy War told was taking a span of 2 generations in terms of time, with you seeing the impact that the events of the first generation story had on the second generation story and characters. And I have to add that Fire Emblem Genealogy of Holy Wars probably got one of the most effective death scenes I've seen in a video game, which is really emotionally gripping, and not to mention that plot twist. And overall, the game was just a pleasure to play through, though there are a couple problems to it, like how much better mounted units are compared to foot units. Heck, Arden is sort of useless since he can't catch up with most of the cast. And speaking of that, the balance of this game can be sort of wonky. And the last negative I'm probably going to mention in Genealogy of the Holy Wars is probably the pacing, in that you'll be spending a lot of time just moving the characters from point A to point B just to get to the enemy, so yeah. At number 1 is Fire Emblem Blazing Sword. So yeah, kind of a predictable and boring choice for Fire Emblem Blazing Sword to be my favorite Fire Emblem game, but it is, and that's really got to do with one thing. I'll probably say that Fire Emblem Blazing Sword does got the best balance out of all the Fire Emblem games that I've played, from the character balance to the type of enemies you be facing. The balance in this game is just superb. Every character you'll be able to recruit just feels like they're very viable characters to bring into the table, feeling different enough in terms of growth stats, and the enemies never feel too easy or too hard while you progress the game. The game just feels really fair in this regard. The level design is also great, with the game providing lots of fun and varied maps to play around with. Now, I probably won't say that Fire Emblem Blazing Sword got like the best level design in the series or is the most creative, but the level design is consistently very well designed. And consistent is probably the best word to describe Fire Emblem Blazing Sword. The level of quality in Fire Emblem Blazing Sword is just very consistent in this game. From the gameplay to the story, it's just a pleasure to play from the start to finish. Granted, Fire Emblem Blazing Sword is sort of like Fire Emblem Sword of Seals in terms of how it doesn't really have the more intricate mechanics from the other games to really differentiate it from the other games in the series, and how it's mostly just got the core mechanics of a Fire Emblem game that fans usually expect. But Blazing Sword does take advantage of this, as it is more easily balanced compared to the other games, since those other intricate mechanics can make the other games hard to balance at times because of so many variables. Fire Emblem Blazing Sword is probably also one of the most accessible Fire Emblem games just because of how well balanced the game is, and how it doesn't really have the more intricate mechanics of the other games to overwhelm newcomers to not only Fire Emblem but all SRPGs in general. And to add, I can't really think of an actual con to Fire Emblem Blazing Sword. I could easily find some negatives to other Fire Emblem games, but the balance of Fire Emblem Blazing Sword is just perfect that I can't really find a flaw in its gameplay. The story is also very enjoyable, with the story being much more personal and small scale as you go through the story of Linda's, Eliwood, and Hector. And I think the more personal and small scale story does have its advantages, as you are allowed to spend more time with the character and allow more breathing room so that you can see how the events of the story is affecting them, and seeing how they develop as characters, which in turn lets you feel invested in the characters. And while I still think Ike is probably the best lore in the series in terms of character development, and he does probably have the best personality to me personally, but the main character in this game are still pretty strong. And the characters in this game is also wonderful, with each character that you be able to recruit just being very fun, distinctive characters, and it's just a pleasure to see the characters interact with each other in the support conversations. So yeah, those are all the reasons why Fire Emblem Blazing Sword is my favorite game in the series. Anyway, this has been a very long video, folks. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you feel up to it, let me know what's your favorite Fire Emblem game or your personal ranking of the Fire Emblem titles I've played in the comment section, or you can even make a video if you're so inclined. Anyway, this is P for Sound Zero Sirus signing off.